My name's Beth Carter. I've been making sculpture for about 25 years. I make figurative work, mainly in clay, have it cast into bronze generally. I live in Bristol and I work in Bristol currently. The reason I sculpt minotaurs has become apparent to me sort of slowly over the years. So I made my first life-size minotaur when I was about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that kind of thing, when I was on a placement in Cyprus from my college course. I had been making minotaurs for probably 10 years before I realised that they were actually, the reason I was so sort of obsessed with them was because they were sort of telling a story, a personal story about my dad. As most people know, the story of the minotaur is full of tragedy, and the minotaur is supposed to be this sort of monstrous creature that's sort of very isolated and lonely in this labyrinth. And basically he's born, he's a victim because he didn't ask to be sort of created, and he's sort of shunned and just put aside. And I realised this connection with my father's story, which, he had a very brutal upbringing. He grew up in North London, very poor, to sort of quite a brutal existence as well. So in some ways, his father was a slaughterman, was an alcoholic, was violent. He had 5 brothers, and they were all sort of beaten regularly. And it was horrible growing up. No education. He was expelled from school, and he was quite a complicated character. He suffered from depression in his later years. So hence our childhood was quite sort of colourful and difficult. But also he brought a lot of magic into our world, and because he was an artist, I was very close to him. Maybe I'm an artist because I was close to him, I don't know. 10 years into making this minotaur figure, I realised that it was basically a symbol for my dad. He grew up, and in his childhood he didn't have any books. He never had a book, which just seems like an impossible thing. My childhood was full of books and full of learning and all that, and it just seemed like an automatic thing that every kid should have. So he never had one, and then I realised I've been making this minotaur reading a book, and it just the whole thing, and it's the kind of intensity that it has, the kind of sadness that it has, the introspection that it has, is all kind of reflecting my dad's, essentially. So it's become a personal symbol, just something that I love. I love the metaphor of the minotaur, the whole story of it, all the loneliness that's involved in it, which my dad certainly went through. He would isolate himself for weeks on end from us. So there he is in his own labyrinth, in his own cave, and so for some reason I felt a lot of empathy for that. The role of masks in my work, I would say, is about the transformative quality of a mask. That once you the obvious thing, once you hide your face, you can be transformed into something else. You're read as something else. And so I think a lot of my work is about transformation, is about shifting from one state to another, or the kind of grey area in between those two states. And so I think using masks symbolises that really well, and makes that quite an immediate thing. You can make a figure and just sort of improvise some mask on it, which I often do, just sort of cardboard or something quite spontaneous and sort of just some improvised material, and it completely takes the figure somewhere else, and it starts to generate a story. It starts to generate a sort of narrative. It starts to suggest things. As a prop, really, as a way of beginning to tell some kind of story. And Messenger in particular, I wanted to make something that would convey a kind of burden, that the message was this rather burdensome, heavy thing to have to deliver, and having this big sort of sad crow's face. Seem to do that, and it's very sort of looking downwards, and it's got this sort of slightly shamed element, and like I said, burdened. And he's got this cloth mask on, and the eyes are sort of stitched in as well, so he's sort of blind, and he's almost muted by it. And I just thought it was a nice complicated thing to do to a figure, and obviously calling it Messenger sort of activates the story behind that figure. So I made Broken Carnival using a slightly different process than I'd used for many years. I've always been interested in fragments, sort of classical fragments, you know, are really evocative. And so I spent a couple of months just creating fragments from scratch, so making just segments of horses in clay. I'd make a rough mould of them and just produce them in plaster. So I'd end up with this whole just a whole assemblage, which basically is like a collage. It's a collage sort of storytelling that's very spontaneous. All these disparate parts, you somehow find this harmony in the form. So, you know, I ended up using 3 heads instead of 4. 3 worked better in a formal way, but it created a movement and it had a sort of dynamism to it. I suppose the theme of the carnival, to me, it's really just a metaphor for the kind of busyness in life. And, you know, it sounds very sort of open and quite vague, which it kind of is. Life does have its disasters, obviously, and things go horribly wrong, and along with all the wonderful magic of life. So, you know, it's the whole complex shebang, really. Turning a sculpture into bronze is I think it ties in with the transformation that is, you know, the subject of my work, but it also happens to be the process, you know, which is sort of a nice circular idea. The impermanence of clay and then transforming it into bronze is just a wonderful idea that it's going to last and last, you know, last longer than me probably. What you've made in clay becomes a wax, is entirely done again in wax, and then that wax disappears entirely at one stage, and then it becomes bronze. So it's alchemical, you know. It just completely, it's like making lead into gold. It's the translation of materials, which is just completely fascinating. And I just love the fact it disappears. It just exists as a mold, you know, 3-dimensional print of what you've made. So it doesn't really exist at one point, and then it comes back again. It sort of goes through all these different lives. That fascinates me. I think that the darkness and light, as you say, is something I sort of only became aware of after sort of many years of making. That you know, once you've got enough of a body of work, you realise that all these themes run through it. And to pull it all back to my childhood, which is really where everything does come from. You know, I did have a lot of dark times, and I did have a lot of light times. You know, I had a lot of love and a lot of sort of stimulating, interesting, you know, cultural life in my family, and it was a very mixed childhood. It was very extreme in both of those ways. What I'm trying to do in my work is to reconcile the dark and the light that exist at the same time, which they do in life. You know, life isn't ever just one or the other.